There is a ceiling of clay above the underworld, and it has been there longer than anything that lives beneath it. And it is packed hard and close, not the loose, crumbling earth of a garden or a riverbed, but the kind of dense, compressed ground that forms over centuries under the weight of everything above it. Stone and silt, and the slow accumulation of all the material the living world deposits downward. Root systems reach into it from above and find no purchase. The clay holds its shape, it holds its silence. Below the surface of the world that Mesopotamian tradition called Ki, the solid ground of the living, and above the great primordial freshwater ocean, the ancients named the Apsu, there is a region that is neither one nor the other, a bounded space with a ceiling and a floor, and that space is core. The clay overhead is its most immediate quality, not its darkness, not its silence, not the dust that coats every surface within it. The clay is the first thing, because the clay is what defines it. Core is a place enclosed. It does not open upward into sky or weather. It does not widen into any horizon. Above it, packed hard and ancient, there is only the underside of the world, where people walk and plant grain and watch the sun cross from east to west. And that underside is dense and unmoving and has never admitted light of any kind down into the space below it. The living world goes about its work above. The clay holds firm between them. The weight of that ceiling is not the weight of stone that might crush or oppress. It is simply the weight of material that has always been there, geological rather than threatening, the ordinary physics of a world built in layers, each layer pressing on the one below it, with the indifferent gravity of mass and time. In Sumerian understanding, the cosmos was arranged exactly this way, an ordered stack of regions, each defined by its position relative to the others, each with its own character and its own inhabitants and its own rules. Ker was the lowest inhabited layer, wedged into its specific position in the cosmological order, the way a stratum of clay is wedged between other strata in the wall of an excavated site, specific, bounded, identifiable, real. What reaches down through that clay ceiling from the world above is almost nothing, not light. In the oldest Sumerian literary texts that describe Ker, including the death of Ur-Nammu, a composition concerned with the arrival of a king in the underworld following his unexpected death, the darkness of Ker is not incidental. It is a positive quality of the place, a thing the space possesses, rather than merely lacks. The darkness of Ker is not the darkness that results from a lamp being extinguished, the ordinary darkness of a room where the fire has gone out. It is a different order of darkness entirely, something that belongs to the space the way density belongs to stone, the way cold belongs to the floor of a very deep lake. It is the darkness of a place that has never held light and has therefore never known the difference. Shadow in the world above is cast by things. A tree makes shade, a building makes shade. A body interposed between the sun and the ground makes a brief moving patch of dark that follows the angle of the light and disappears entirely when the light goes. Shadow in that world is defined by its relationship to what produces it, and by the fact that it can always be stepped out of. In Ker, the darkness is not like that. There is nothing to cast it, and nothing to escape it into. It is simply the condition of the space, as complete and consistent and unremarkable as the stillness of the clay above. Consider what it means for darkness to be a positive quality of a place rather than an absence. In ordinary experience, darkness is what remains when light withdraws. It is relational, secondary, defined by what is not there. But Ker's darkness preceded the light of the upper world. Kher existed as a bounded region before the sun began its daily crossing, and its darkness is therefore not the darkness that results from the sun being elsewhere. It is an older darkness, one that has its own substance and weight and character. The clay ceiling above holds this darkness in the way a sealed vessel holds its contents, not by keeping other things out, by holding this one thing in. The dust is slower than the darkness. It settles. That is the particular quality of Kher's dust, not the swirling, blown-about dust of a dry plain in high wind, not the gritty friction of sand moving in a sandstorm, but something far more patient and final. The Akkadian descent of Ishtar, which carries this tradition forward into the later period, and calls the underworld region by a name that translates as a house of dust, treats that dust not as poetic decoration applied to a pre-existing description, but as the substance through which the underworld is understood. Dust is what the underworld is made of, at the level of its essential material. The figures who dwell permanently in Kher wear dust on their bodies and on their garments. The garments themselves are described as dust, not as though they were covered in dust, but as though dust was the fabric from which they were constructed, the material of permanent residence in this place. Fine gray dust, settling slowly in still air, covers surfaces the way time covers things, gradually, evenly, without preference for one object or another, accumulating in the folds of cloth and the creases of surfaces and the angle where a wall meets a floor, filling in the small spaces, first before it thickens on the larger ones. In a space with no air moving through it, with no sound from above to disturb its accumulation, the dust of Kher settles with the patience of sediment falling through the still water of a lightless lake toward the lake's floor, where it will join all the sediment that fell before it and be indistinguishable from it, and rest. The quality of that settling is one of the most specific material facts the tradition records about the underworld, not dramatic, not oppressive, simply precise. Dust settles here. It covers things. It persists. The terrain of Kher itself is compressed clay and mineral earth, not loose or sandy, but dense in the way that clay is dense when it has been under pressure for a long time and has expelled whatever water it once held. This is not the open rolling landscape that certain later traditions would use to imagine their own underworlds. There are no open plains or dim meadows. The ground of Kher holds the impression of weight long after the weight is gone, the way waterlogged clay holds the print of a footstep after the foot has lifted and moved on. The descent of Inanna, the Sumerian text which describes the descent of the goddess Inanna into Kher, does not characterize the terrain as spectacular or strange, but as bounded and enclosing, a place that compresses rather than opens out, that reduces rather than expands. The ground is simply the ground, old, close, dense, continuous. In the Akkadian account, Kher is called the land of no return. The phrase appears not once but consistently as a name, a proper designation, the thing by which this place is known. The land of no return is a cosmological description before it is anything else. It names the defining structural relationship between Kher and the world above, which is that the direction of travel is one way. There is no road that leads back out through the clay and into the sunlit world on the other side of it. The path that descends into Kher does not double back. The name encodes this as simply and directly as a map notation encodes the direction of a current in a river, the land of no return, the place where return is not something that happens. Part of what that name designates is geographic, but part of what it designates is material. Nothing green grows in Kher, No grain is produced there, no vegetation of any kind, no sustaining food generated from the earth. Where the fertile land of the world above was defined by the Mesopotamians through its relationship to growing things, to grain and date palm, and the crops that came from the well-managed irrigation of the river plains, Kir is the categorical opposite of that fertility, a place defined by the specific absence of anything that produces nourishment from the ground. In the descent of Ishtar, this is stated plainly: no green thing, no grain, no food of the sustaining kind that the living world generates from its soil. This is not presented as punishment or deprivation in those texts. It is presented as geography, as the known condition of a specific region in the layered Mesopotamian cosmos, as matter of fact, as describing the fact that a desert receives little rain. Imagine the earth simply continuous and unbroken, no root systems pushing downward in search of water, no pressure from below where a seed is germinating and working its way up toward the surface, no sign of the upward reaching effort that characterizes all plant life when it encounters soil it can work with, incur. The soil is not hostile to growth in the way that salted earth or poisoned ground is hostile. It is simply complete in itself, already what it is, not requiring anything to push through it or emerge from it. The ground is ground, the clay is clay. The absence of vegetation is not emptiness. Exactly, it is more like fullness, the fullness of a material that is simply, without remainder, what it is. This is the cosmological opposite of Kai, the living world, in a way that is structural rather than merely contrasting. Kachi is defined by its relationship to things that grow and change and pass through cycles. The grain dies and is planted and grows and is harvested and ground into flour and consumed, and the field is prepared again, and the cycle continues. The relationship between the ground and the things that grow from it is one of constant exchange, constant movement between states. In Kir, that exchange is absent. The cycle stops. The ground makes nothing and receives things, the dead, the dust, the silence, and holds them in the way the clay ceiling holds the darkness above, by being exactly what it is and continuing to be it. There is a river in the dark. The Mesopotamian texts call it Hubor, and it is the boundary the tradition positions at the edge of Kir, the cosmological waterway that a newly dead soul must cross in order to arrive in the underworld proper. Hubor is not a quiet river. Ancient sources describe it as roiling and formidable, its surface characterized by movement that seems improbable in the still enclosed world of Kir, a river with force and volume and current, carrying its water through the dark without the benefit of any visible source or visible destination. The ferryman of the Hubor is attested in Mesopotamian texts, a figure who navigates the crossing and who occupies the specific institutional role of the one who moves between the bank of the living world and the bank of Kir, the one who has made that crossing so many times that the river's particular behavior on a given day is simply the river, familiar and unremarkable, neither frightening nor strange. The tradition of a river marking the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead is not unique to Mesopotamia. It would appear again, much later, and in a different cultural context, in the Greek figure of Charon on the river Styx, a parallel that scholars have long noted as evidence of either shared deep structure or cultural transmission. But in the Mesopotamian account, the Hubor is not primarily a backdrop to the ferryman's drama. It is a cosmological feature, a real and specific waterway in the geography of the underworld, as real within that geography as the Euphrates was real in the geography of the living world, a river that did what rivers do, moved water from one place to another, separated one bank from another, required a crossing to pass from one side to the other. The clay beneath the feet of anyone standing on the near bank of the Hubor is the same clay as the clay of Ker's terrain, dense, old, holding its shape under the weight that has pressed it down over time. The river's surface, described as formidable, breaks the stillness that characterizes the rest of the underworld's geography, introduces movement into a space that is otherwise defined by its quality of cessation. The current moves in the dark. It goes about its business without any light to move in and without any audience to observe it, because the dead who have arrived at the near bank are waiting for the ferryman and cannot yet see the far bank, and the far bank is simply not visible from the near one. The river is too wide, the dark too complete, for either shore to be apparent from the other. What that width implies, held in the imagination, is a quality of scale. Ker is not small, the clay ceiling is close, and the terrain is dense and compressing, and yet the Hubur is wide enough that its far shore is invisible from the near one. This is the particular kind of scale that belongs to old, unmapped, bounded spaces, not the grand scale of open sky and distant horizon, but the scale of depth and interiority, the sense that the space extends further in its own direction than can be measured from a single vantage point. Standing on the near bank of the Hubur, in the dark with the current moving across the surface of the water, somewhere out there in the direction of the far shore, the width of the river is a felt quality rather than a measured one. The ear can register the sound of moving water fading out in the direction of the unseen bank. The eye finds nothing to anchor to. The far side of the Hubur might be very far away, or only moderately far, in the dark, with no light source and no landmark. The distance is simply not available as information. It is only present as the specific quality of a very large body of water in a very dark place. The cosmological position of Ker, wedged between Kid above and the Apsu below, gave the ancient Mesopotamians a geography that was layered and coherent, and within its own terms, precise. The Apsu, the great freshwater ocean beneath the earth, was understood as the source of the water in springs and wells and rivers. The water that fed the irrigation systems the Mesopotamian cities depended on rose from the Apsu, filtered up through the layers of the earth. This meant that the water within the earth was connected to a vast subterranean body of water that was itself a named and bounded cosmological region, not simply an abstract notion of wetness beneath the ground. Ker sat between these two defined regions, Kid above, Apsu below, and its position in that stack was specific and known. If you drilled down through Kid, you would reach Ker. If you drilled further through Ker, you would reach the Apsu. The layers were real in the sense that the tradition held them as real, and the tradition held them with the confidence of people who had thought carefully about the structure of the world and arrived at a description that accounted for all the evidence they had. Evidence that included the behavior of water in the ground. Evidence that included the way light ended at the horizon. Evidence that included the fact that the dead were buried in the earth and did not return. The Mesopotamian cosmological geography of Ker was not arrived at as a pure act of imagination. It was constructed as an account of the world that made the observed evidence cohere. The dead go down, water comes up from below. Darkness is absolute in the space beneath the earth's surface. These observations, fitted together into a coherent geographic model, produced Ker, the bounded underworld between the living ground and the deep water, dark and still, and dusted with the fine gray material that accumulates in still air over a very long time. The clay ceiling does not shift. The darkness does not vary. The dust accumulates in its patient, unhurried way on every surface, in every fold of every garment worn by the permanent residents of this place, with the same steady evenness it has always shown. Kher is not a place defined by event. It is a place defined by condition, the accumulated, settled quality of a location that has been what it is for a very long time and will continue to be what it is without reference to what is happening above it in the sunlit world where grain grows and rivers run and the sun crosses the sky from east to west and sets and rises and crosses again. And in that repetition, the sun's daily crossing above, the stillness of the underworld below, there is something almost calming about the distinction between the two regions. Kid is the place of cycling and exchange, the world that generates and consumes and decays and regenerates. Kher is the place where the cycling stops, not as a catastrophe, not as a failure, simply as the nature of a different kind of place. The grain eventually does not grow anymore. The river eventually does not reach the field. The sun, in its daily crossing, descends each evening below the western horizon and enters in Mesopotamian understanding a region of darkness before it reemerges at dawn, and that nightly disappearance of the sun touches the same geography that Kher inhabits, the territory beneath the surface, the dark and bounded space that persists while the living world above goes through its ordinary cycles of light and weather and season. The clay of Kher holds the impression of things. This quality, the way dense, moist clay records and retains the marks made in it, is one of the properties that made clay so important to Mesopotamian civilization in the world above. Clay tablets received the impression of a stylus and held it. Clay bricks received the impression of the mold and held it. Clay walls received the impression of whatever pressed against them, and if dried and undisturbed, preserved that impression indefinitely. Kher's terrain, in the tradition's descriptions, has this quality at a geological scale, a permanence of impression, a holding of shape under weight, a density that retains. The dead who arrive in Kher arrive in a place that is made of material with memory, not the memory of mind, but the physical memory of compressed matter that holds the shape it was given long after the original force has lifted. There is no erosion in Kher. Erosion requires moving water, moving wind, the active cycling of weather that breaks surfaces down and carries them elsewhere and rebuilds them in different configurations. In Kher, there is the Huber, but its water does not fall as rain on Kher's terrain or run in tributaries across it. The river is a boundary, not a presence within the landscape. The terrain of Kher is not shaped by weather. It is shaped by pressure, by the weight above it and the weight of everything deposited into it, pressing down from above, accumulating without removal, adding layer by layer of the fine gray dust that settles in the still air. In geological terms, the geography of Kher is entirely sedimentary, a place of accumulation and compression, of things deposited rather than things moved. The Huber moves its water. That is the single dynamic fact in Kher's geography, the single thing that behaves like the living world, that has current and direction and the continuous motion characteristic of flowing water. The rest of Kher is defined by its stillness. The clay is still. The dust settles into stillness once it has finished falling. The darkness is still in the sense that darkness cannot move. It is simply the quality of the space, unchanging and without variation. But the Hubera moves. Its surface, described in the tradition as roiling, suggests a river with real force, with the kind of current that results from water under pressure, water that has somewhere to go and is going there. Where the Huber's water comes from and where it is going are not questions the tradition directly answers. The river simply is a cosmological feature placed at the boundary of Kerr, doing what rivers do, with or without observation, in the complete dark of the space below the earth. The near bank of the Huber, in the dark, at whatever hour the dead arrive, because the tradition does not specify what time of day arrivals occur, and perhaps time of day is itself a quality that belongs to Key rather than to Kerr, is a specific place in the geography of the underworld. Solid ground underfoot, dense, close clay. No light by which to see the surface of the river, except in whatever sense the river's movement can be heard and felt in the air above it. The ferryman figure, attested in Mesopotamian texts as the navigator of this crossing, would be somewhere on the water, on the near side or the far side, or in the middle of the crossing, depending on when the arrival happens. The river continues moving, regardless of whether the ferryman is present at the bank. The water does not wait for arrivals. It does not slow for crossings. And from the near bank, if one stood in the dark and listened, the Hubir would be audible as moving water always is, the continuous sound of current over whatever the riverbed is made of, the sound of water with force behind it, maintaining its movement through the dark of the underworld's geography, without urgency, without any particular destination that needs reaching by a specific time, simply going where water goes, when it flows through a place that is otherwise defined by stillness. The far bank remains invisible. The darkness is complete between the near shore and wherever the other side lies, out there in the distance that cannot be measured by sight alone, in a place with no light. The river is wide, the dark is total, the current moves steadily in its ancient channel, carrying its water from wherever it comes from toward wherever it is going, doing exactly this, exactly what it is doing in this moment, in this dark, and has been doing for a very long time. The first gate of Kerr is stone set into stone, a door in a frame worn to a faint smoothness, at the height where hands have rested, and shoulders have brushed against the edge in passing. It stands in the earth's dark interior, where the packed clay of the surrounding walls holds the kind of cold that is not the cold of wind or winter, but the steady, still cold of a place that has never been warm and does not require warmth to be exactly what it is. The door is closed. On one side of it, a passage continues deeper into the dark. On the other side, which is the side from which arrivals come, the darkness is the same quality of air, the same stillness, and yet it is a different darkness, because somewhere above it there is a surface, and above that surface the sky, and the threshold marks the precise boundary between the world where those things matter and the world where they do not. Nettie stands to one side of the door. The texts that preserve his name and office describe him as the chief gatekeeper of Kerr, the appointed representative of the realm at its outermost threshold, and his posture here is that of someone who has been present at this door for longer than most of what exists in the upper world has been in existence. He does not carry a weapon. His work is not force but procedure, the management of sequential passage, according to instructions he has received from deeper in the realm. Instructions he holds not on any tablet, but in the careful architecture of his memory, each gate and each requirement indexed with the precision of someone for whom error is not a possibility worth entertaining. The door behind him remains closed. He is patient in the way that a feature of the earth's interior is patient, not waiting for anything in particular, simply present, simply there, in the dark that is the permanent condition of this place. What he governs is not a single door, but a system of 7, each set at a specific distance from the last, each marking a further transition from the surface world above into the deep interior of Current. The Sumerian text known as the Descent of Inanna, preserved on tablets recovered primarily from the ancient city of Nippur, and among the oldest sustained literary accounts of the underworld that survives, describes these gates in sequence, names the items surrendered at each one, and traces the progressive passage of a figure from the surface of the upper world into the throne room of the realm below. The gates are not ornamental, they are not dramatic devices placed there for the pleasure of a story. They are the mechanism by which Kerr organizes its relationship with whatever arrives from above, and they function with the same orderly inevitability as the laws governing how water moves from one level to another. Not because anyone decided in that moment that it would be so, but because that is how the system is built, and the system has been built for a very long time. The stone of the first gate is dark in the way that stone deep in the earth is dark, not painted or stained, but absorbing whatever small quantity of light might reach it and returning nothing. The door itself is massive, its weight proportioned to its purpose, which is not to be ornamental, but to require intention to pass through. A person does not drift through this gate accidentally. Every arrival is a deliberate act. The gate's function is partly this, to make the passage an event, not a coincidence, to require each entrant to stop, to be assessed, and to leave something behind before continuing. What exactly is left behind at the first gate belongs to the text and to the particular figure the text describes. The structure of the gate itself is older and more general than any individual descent. It was there before the stories that pass through it, and it remains after those stories conclude. In the tradition, as the Sumerians understood it, Neti does not make decisions at the threshold. His role is transmission rather than judgment, carrying the instructions he receives from Ereshkigal, who rules from deeper within the realm, and applying them with the careful consistency of someone who understands that the value of a system lies in its regularity. When a visitor arrives at the outer gate, Neti's first act is not to open the door, but to descend into the interior, to carry word of the arrival to Ereshkigal, and to receive in return the specific instructions governing this particular entrance passage. He then returns to the gate and proceeds. Each gate requires this kind of attention, not because Neti lacks the authority to act independently, but because the gates of Kerr are not his to manage arbitrarily. They are Ereshkigal's realm, and the instructions flow outward from her throne through Neti to the threshold, in a chain of administrative order that places the authority of judgment exactly where it belongs. The passage from one gate to the next is a passage into increasing enclosure. This is one of the qualities the text traces most carefully. The way each successive threshold presses closer, darkens further, reduces the entrant in some specific and documentable way. The first gate is the outermost, the least removed from the world above, and whatever faint sense of that world might accompany an arrival, whatever quality of air or memory or habit of being that belongs to the upper world, it begins to thin with the first passage through stone, not violently, not all at once, the way sound thins as a person moves away from its source, gradually, measurably, until the specific character of it is no longer quite distinguishable, and only a residual impression remains. At each gate, in the account the descent of Inanna preserves, a specific item is surrendered. The text is exact about this. It does not describe vague diminishments, but named objects with documented identities. The lapis lazuli crown that the descending figure wears at the first gate is a specific object, lapis lazuli, the deep blue stone that held particular significance in Mesopotamian material culture, associated with the heavens, with royalty, with the divine regalia of gods and kings. To remove it at the first gate and set it aside is not an impoverishment described in general terms, but a specific and traceable transaction. This object, at this gate, left on this side of the threshold, while the figure who wore it steps forward to the next. The stone does not catch any light as it is set down. The surface on which it rests is not visible. The object simply passes from being worn to being held to being placed, and then the passage through the gate continues. A measuring rod and a line follow at the second gate. What these are instruments of authority, the specific tools by which a divine figure of Inanna's domain measured and ordered the world, apportioned land, and established boundaries, performed the practical governance of space that was among the primary roles of a deity whose power extended across the civilized and cultivated order of the upper world. To leave them at the second gate is to leave behind a very specific kind of agency, not abstract authority, but the physical capacity for the particular kind of action those instruments represent. They, too, are set down in the dark, on the unilluminated surface of a gate, whose existence is entirely functional, entirely architectural, entirely without aesthetic consideration. The instruments rest there, and the figure continues. The double strand of beads at the third gate, a gold ring at the fourth, a breastplate at the fifth. At each successive gate, the ceremony of removal proceeds with the same orderly precision that governed the first, because the system does not accelerate or intensify as it progresses. It simply continues, gate by gate, bar low, in the same measured way that the distance between one gate and the next remains roughly constant, and the darkness deepens by roughly the same degree at each passage. By the time the fifth gate is behind the descending figure, the items left at the preceding gates are not retrievable, not because anyone prevents their retrieval, but because retrieval would require passing backward through gates that are designed to pass through in one direction only, and the architecture of Kerr does not accommodate backtracking. What has been left behind remains behind. The passage goes forward. At the sixth gate, a royal garment. At the seventh, the last item, and then the innermost space of the realm, which is a different kind of space entirely, not a gate's anteroom or a corridor's continuation, but the destination that all 7 passages were oriented toward, the throne room of Ereshkigal, toward which the entire sequence of thresholds has served as an extended and carefully managed approach. The text holds that destination for what comes after the 7th gate's passage. What belongs to the gate system itself is the sequence, the 7 thresholds, the 7 items surrendered, the progressive movement from surface to interior, accomplished not in a single bound, but through 7 discrete and individually governed stages, each one complete in itself, each one marking a position in the journey, as clearly as the gates of a city mark the positions of its walls. The figure of Neti, moving ahead of an arriving visitor through these passages, carrying a lamp and some readings, guiding without hurrying in all of them, is a figure of the specific kind of authority that belongs to institutional knowledge rather than force. He knows where each gate is. He knows the exact sequence of the surrenders required. He knows the distance between them and the precise manner in which each gate is opened and secured after passage. His footsteps are measured in the lampless corridors of packed earth and stone, and he does not look back unnecessarily, because the path is known to him, and there is no element of uncertainty in the process that would require him to pause and reconsider. He is not a guardian in the martial sense. He does not defend the gates against intrusion. He manages their passage with the competence and consistency of someone whose office is very old and whose execution of it is entirely reliable. The corridors between the gates are not ornamented. The architecture of Kher is not concerned with appearance. There is no surface audience for the design of its interior spaces, no upper world visitor for whom a gate or a corridor might be made to seem impressive rather than functional. What the texts describe of the spaces between the thresholds is packed earth and stone, the same mineral density that characterizes the whole of the realm, close and dense and consistent in the way that the earth's interior is consistent, not because someone chose to make it that way for effect, but because that is the nature of the material from which it is made. The walls do not provide information. The ceiling is the same packed clay overhead that has always been the ceiling of Kher, continuous and unbroken, through which no sound from the living world travels clearly, and through which no light has ever passed. There is something in the orderliness of the gate system worth sitting with for a moment. The way it reflects a Mesopotamian cosmological commitment to the idea that even the most significant boundaries in the universe are managed by specific named personnel, following specific documented instructions. The threshold between life and death in the Sumerian tradition is not a dissolution into formlessness. It is a door. It has a keeper. The keeper has instructions. The instructions come from authority. The authority resides in a throne room at the end of a corridor that 7 gates protect. This is not the landscape of chaos, but the landscape of administration, and the administration is very old and very thorough, and it proceeds whether or not anyone from the upper world is watching, because it is not performed for witnesses, but simply executed, gate by gate, in the dark that is the permanent and characteristic light of Kher. The items surrendered at the gates have been the subject of considerable attention from scholars who read the descent texts, and the readings are not uniform. Some emphasize the stripping away as a kind of ritual preparation for death, a gradual relinquishment of the markers of living identity that prepares the entrant for the condition of the dead. Others read it as a test, or as a reflection of Ereshkigal's power over even the greatest deities of the upper pantheon, that Inanna, the greatest of the sky god's daughters, the goddess of love and war and the ordering of civilization, can be reduced to her essential self at the boundary between the two realms, her regalia catalogued and held by the keeper of the gates, until some future resolution of the question of whether she will ever pass back through them. The text itself does not editorialize, it narrates. This is removed at this gate, this is set aside. The figure continues, the gate closes. The next gate is ahead. What the stones of the gates actually looked like, their precise dimensions, their material composition beyond the broad category of stone, the manner in which they were hung and opened, the texts do not specify. What survives is the structure, 7, in sequence, each requiring passage in order, each associated with a specific surrender and a specific deepening of enclosure. The number 7 is not incidental in Mesopotamian cosmological thinking. It appears with structural regularity across multiple traditions, associated with completeness, with the ordering of the cosmos, with the idea that a number of things sufficient to constitute a whole is in some meaningful way 7 rather than 6 or 8. 7 gates makes the underworld a complete underworld, bounded and fully realized, not truncated or approximate. The system is what it is, and 7 is how many gates complete it. There is one figure who passes through the gates of Kher in a direction that is not the usual direction. The sun god Utu, known in the Akkadian tradition as Shamash, moves downward through the western edge of the world each evening, descending by a specific passage that is, In the Mesopotamian understanding of the cosmos, contiguous with the entrance through which the dead travel. This was not a metaphor employed at a distance. The daily disappearance of the sun below the western horizon was understood in the framework the Mesopotamians used to organize the cosmos as a literal descent, the sun god making the same movement that the dead make, traveling downward through the same cosmological territory that lies below the surface of the living world, moving through the darkness of the night in the realm beneath before ascending again in the east at dawn. The gates of Kor, in this understanding, open each evening to admit a god rather than a mortal, and the god passes through, and the darkness of Kor is temporarily lit by his passage before he emerges again through a different opening in the earth's far edge to begin the next day's arc across the sky. This makes the nightly sunset something more specific than it might otherwise appear. In the Mesopotamian frame, each evening as the light fades from the western sky and the disk of the sun descends below the horizon, what is happening is a version of what always happens at the first gate of Kor, an arrival, a passage, a movement from the upper world into the realm below. The sun's passage is not permanent and does not follow the full gate ritual of surrender and enclosure, because the sun is not entering Kor to stay. His movement through the underworld's dark is provisional and temporary, a nightly transit that ends in re-emergence rather than in the throne room of Ereshkigal. But the path is the same path. The gate, in some sense, is the same gate, and the fact of Utu's regular passage through that gate made the boundary between the living world and the dead one not a place that was visited only once, in one direction, by souls departing the upper world, but a crossing that a god made regularly in both directions, as the ordinary business of keeping the sky lit. There is something in this that is quietly useful to the imagination. The idea that the westward path of the sun, as ordinary and daily and universally observable as anything in the ancient world, was in the Mesopotamian understanding a kind of nightly rehearsal of descent. Every sunset was in miniature a movement through the same geography the dead inhabit. Every sunrise was a return. The gate of Kor was not a remote or inaccessible feature of a purely theoretical cosmology. It was built into the structure of the observable sky, activated and confirmed each evening by the movement of a god who made the transit as a matter of cosmic routine. Niti, standing at his post at the first gate, would have been familiar with Utu's passage. The sun god's transit is not described in the same texts that describe the gate ritual of the descent of Inanna in any extended way, but the cosmological architecture is consistent across multiple Mesopotamian texts. The west is the direction of entry, the sun descends through it, and the boundary between the worlds is in that direction, located at the edge of the earth where the light goes. For Nati at his post, Utu's passage would have been as regular and as unremarkable as anything that happens on a fixed schedule is to the person responsible for managing it. The gate opens, the god passes, the gate closes, the darkness continues. There in the morning, the reverse, the return, and then the long interval of the day before it happens again. The 7 gates of Kor are a very old architecture. The tablets that preserve their description date primarily to the Old Babylonian period, to the general range of the 19th through the 16th centuries before the Common Era, but the tradition they record is understood to be older than its written form, transmitted through scribal schools and temple libraries and the ordinary movement of literary culture through the cities of the ancient river valley, accumulating the particular authority that comes to things which have been known for a long time and which no one alive remembers a time before knowing. By the time the descent of Inanna was written down in the form that has survived, the 7 gates of Kura were already old, already fixed in their number and their sequence, already attended by Nati performing the office that the texts assign to him, with the institutional stability of a feature of the world that simply is, in the same way that the Euphrates simply is, or the clay of the river plain simply is, not because it was recently decided, but because it has always been so for as long as any account extends. The gate at the edge of the world that the setting sun passes through each evening is in the west, and the direction west in Mesopotamian cosmological orientation carries with it the accumulated association of that daily observation. Westward is the direction in which the light diminishes, in which the sun travels when it travels away from the sky, in which the entrance to the realm below is located. The dead travel in that direction. The sun travels in that direction. The particular passage between the living world and Kur is oriented toward the place where, each evening, the sky changes color and then goes dark. And the change of color and the going dark are in this framework not merely the behavior of light in an atmosphere, but the visible surface sign of a god passing through a gate, moving from one realm into the other, taking the light with him for the duration of the night. Standing at the western edge of the world, which in Mesopotamian geographical imagination was a real edge, a physical boundary at the far reach of the known world, where the earth met something else, the opening into Kur would have been understood as a specific feature of the landscape, no less real and no less material than the entrance to a temple or the gate of a city. It is not metaphorical. In the cosmological system the tradition employs, the underworld is below and the surface is above, and the passage between them is a physical passage attended by a physical gatekeeper, governed by physical rules. The 7 gates are stone thresholds in a stone system. The surrendered objects rest on surfaces in the dark. The corridor between the first gate and the last is a corridor with a ceiling and walls and a floor, and Neti's footsteps make contact with that floor when he moves along it. The compressing quality of the gate system, the way each successive passage deepens the enclosure and diminishes the entrant, is not a quality that requires distress to be accurate. It is simply what the architecture does. A person moving through 7 successive thresholds, each one deeper than the last, each one requiring the surrender of something that was part of their identity in the world above, arrives at the end of the sequence as something smaller and quieter than what they were at the beginning. This is not presented in the tradition as a cruelty or as a punishment, but as the nature of the passage. What it cost to enter Kur is exactly this, the progressive relinquishment of what belongs to the upper world, gate by gate, until what remains is what Kur receives and holds. The architecture is honest about its effects. The gates do not pretend to take nothing in exchange for admission. They take specific things at specific points with specific ceremony, and what they take is documented and named. The stones of the outer gate are still in darkness, still in the same cold and still air that characterizes all of Kur's interior. The door frame holds its worn smoothness where the hands and shoulders of uncounted arrivals have brushed against it across an uncountable span of time. Neti stands in his position to one side of it, his instructions received and memorized, his role neither martial nor theatrical, but administrative, the careful execution of a system that predates him and will continue after any particular visitor has passed through and proceeded to whatever lies beyond the 7th threshold. The gate does not hurry. The gate has no urgency, because the gate has been exactly as it is for as long as anything has been entering Kur, and what enters will enter in the proper sequence at the proper time, and the gates will open and close as gates open and close, and the items will be surrendered as items are surrendered, and the passage will proceed as the passage has always proceeded. Deep in the west, beyond the edge of the known world, the sun descends each evening toward its entry point. The light in the western sky moves through the particular color that comes just before the color goes, a sequence so familiar to the people of the ancient river valley that it requires no description, only the recognition that in the cosmological frame they inherited and maintained, what is visible above corresponds to something happening below. The great disk of UTU, the sun god, approaches the opening in the earth's edge that leads downward into the territory of the dark, and the sky above it changes. And then the disk is below the horizon, and the sky is what it is after the light has gone, not empty, but full of the particular quality of night, wide and dark, and carrying the stars that were always behind the day's brightness, and now can be seen. Below the surface, in the realm that lies between the living earth and the primordial waters of the Apsu, Neti has opened the first gate for the evening's passage. The sun god moves through it, and the dark through which he moves is the same dark that fills the corridors between all 7 thresholds, the same still air, the same packed clay underfoot and overhead. His passage is not slow. His passage through the night is governed by the need to emerge again in the east at dawn, and the hours of darkness are the hours of his transit through the realm below, moving through Kurd as a traveler moves through familiar country, not stopping, not turning aside, completing a path he has completed every night, for as long as there has been a night to complete. By the time he emerges again, and the eastern sky begins to change, he will have crossed the entire breadth of the underworld's dark, from the first gate in the west to the other side of the world in the east, and the light will return as it always returns, and the day will begin as the day always begins, and in Kur the darkness will simply continue, as it always continues, undisturbed by his departure, unchanged by his having been there, steady and old and very wide in the dark. The 7 gates stand where they have always stood. The river Huber, further back in the direction from which all arrivals come, moves in the dark with its own unhurried current, carrying its ancient burden of boundary and threshold, the sound of it steady and unchanging in the complete dark of the realm below. Neti is at his post. The sun has descended for the night. The gates of Kur are doing what gates do in the dark, when no one in the upper world is watching, standing in their stone frames, worn and patient and entirely sufficient for the purpose for which they have always been intended. The system of 7 thresholds, proceeding in its orderly and undramatic way, through another night and then another, as it has proceeded through every night since the tradition first described it, and will continue to proceed through every night that follows. And the darkness that is not threatening, but simply present, simply the condition of this place, the permanent and particular quality of the world below. The world, the throne of Ereshkigal, stood in a room with no windows. There were no lamps, no oil flames set into the walls, no reflected light from above. The room was not dark in the way a room becomes dark when its candles are extinguished. It was dark in the way clay is dark, in the way packed earth is dark, with the complete and settled darkness of something that has never known light and does not register its absence. The throne itself was large. The texts that record Ereshkigal's court do not describe its material in detail, but they describe its placement at the center of a hall deep within the palace of Kur, set on ground that had not been touched by warmth or sound from the world above for longer than any text thought to measure. Before any figure is described, Before any inhabitant of this court is named, it is worth sitting with that room for a moment. Its dimensions, its quiet, the way a throne at the center of absolute dark carries a different weight than a throne raised on a sunlit dais. There is no crowd in this hall. There is no noise of petition or procession. The governance of Ker did not work that way, according to the texts that preserve its structure. It worked in the manner of all things in Ker, with the steady, unhurried administration of a realm that had no particular urgency about it, because no one who arrived here was going anywhere else. Ereshkigal herself, whose name in Sumerian means Great Lady of the Great Earth, is among the oldest attested deities in the entire Mesopotamian tradition. Her presence in written records reaches back to the early dynastic period, somewhere around 2900 to 2350 BCE, which places her among the very first figures the cuneiform tradition set down in durable form. What is notable about her, when you read the texts that describe her directly, is that she is given a psychological depth unusual for divine figures of her period. The myths that survive her are not simple. She appears in grief. She appears in rage. She appears in what the descent of Inanna describes as physical suffering, clutching at herself, her body responding to pain in the way a mortal body responds to pain. For a queen of the dead, sitting alone at the center of the darkest place in the Mesopotamian cosmos, this is a remarkable portrait. She is not a distant or static figure, Dinghammering Feo. She is someone who has governed a great and particular realm for an incomprehensibly long time, and who carries the weight of that governance in her body. The throne room she occupied was hers entirely. There were no windows because there was nothing to window onto. The palace of Ker was itself deep within Ker, surrounded by the same packed clay and mineral dark that constituted the underworld's substance everywhere. No sound from the surface reached this far. The ordinary noises of the living world, the sounds of the city, of the river, of animals moving through fields in early morning, did not filter downward through that much earth. The silence of the throne room was therefore not an imposed silence, not a silence held in place by ceremony or authority, but the natural silence of a room that had never been close enough to noise to know what noise was. Ereshkigal sat in this room on her throne, and the darkness around her was simply the condition of the place she governed, neither threatening nor oppressive. A geographer would note it and move on. The first named official of her court to be considered is Namtar, whose name in Sumerian translates to something close to Fate Cutter, the one who severs the thread of a life. Namtar served as Ereshkigal's chief minister, the primary administrative agent through whom the business of Ker was conducted and dispatched. He appears in Mesopotamian texts in two related capacities, as the internal administrator of the underworld, executing Ereshkigal's decisions and managing the practical operations of the realm, and as the point of interface between Ker and the world above, the mechanism through which the underworld's influence made itself felt among the living. This second capacity was a specific one. Mesopotamian medical and ritual literature associated Namtar with 60 specific diseases, understood not as coincidental ailments or natural misfortunes, but as entities dispatched from Ker to afflict the living above. The number 60 appears consistently across multiple sources, which suggests this was a settled and relatively stable element of how Mesopotamian tradition understood Namtar's function, not a vague association with illness in general, but a precisely enumerated catalog of what he was responsible for. What is interesting about Namtar, when his role is read as an administrative one rather than a sinister one, is how orderly it makes the relationship between Ker and the upper world appear. Namtar did not act randomly or arbitrarily, at least not within the framework the tradition provides. He carried the weight of 60 specific conditions like a ledger of standing responsibilities. He walked the corridors of Ker's palace on business that was, in its own domain, both very old and very consequential, the way a minister walks the corridors of any institution old enough to have accumulated centuries of established practice. Following routes that have been walked so many times, they require no thought. The 60 diseases he administered were not described as punishments in the texts that mention them. They were simply the extension of Namtar's function outward from the underworld's borders into the world above. The boundary between the living and the dead, in this understanding, was permeable in specific and documented ways, and Namtar was one of the agents through which that permeability was expressed. Namtar's physical environment, the palace he moved through, the corridors between the throne room and the gates, is not described in great material detail in the surviving texts, but the broader texture of Ker applies to it. Those corridors were dark. The floors were packed earth. There was no warmth in the air, because warmth belonged to the upper world, to the sun, and to fire, both of which were absent here. A minister walking through the palace of Ker on his administrative rounds moved through a cold, dark, deeply silent set of passageways with the efficient unhurriedness of someone who knew every turn, who had made this walk many thousands of times, who did not need light to navigate. Namtar walking purposefully through the dark of Ker's corridors is not a frightening image despite the nature of his work. It is a functional one, the image of a specific kind of official undertaking, a specific kind of task in an environment precisely suited to that task. The question of how Ker came to have not one divine ruler but two opens into one of the more notable myths associated with the underworld. In the beginning of the tradition, in the oldest layers of the record, Ereshkigal governed Ker alone. She was its queen, its sole authority, its founding occupant, and the administration of the dead was hers to manage without co-rule. The arrival of Nergal as co-ruler came later, and by a path that the tradition describes in careful, almost procedural terms. Nergal was a god of particular qualities, associated with the destructive heat of the midsummer sun, with war, with plague, with the violent forms of death that came in great and sudden numbers. His cult was centered at the city of Kotha, known also as Gudua, which served as one of the principal sites of underworld worship in ancient Mesopotamia. At Kutha, on the surface of the earth, a physical temple stood where the living addressed prayers and offerings to the power that governed the world below. There was nothing unusual about this. Within the Mesopotamian religious system, many of Ker's divine inhabitants were addressed through temples and cults maintained by living priests in living cities. The underworld was not unreachable from the surface. It was a specific place, administered by specific figures, addressed through specific ritual structures. The temple at Kutha was a real building. It had rooms, precincts, a staff of priests who maintained its function, a history of offerings made and received. That a building dedicated to the ruler of the underworld stood in the open air under the sky, in a city full of living people, is one of the more quietly interesting features of how Mesopotamian cosmology actually operated in practice. The dead were below, their ruler was below, but the rituals through which the living maintained their relationship to that realm happened above, in the ordinary material world, in buildings that could be walked into and out of at the beginning and end of a working day. Nergal's temple at Kutha was not a place of dread. It was a place of contact, a specific address at which a specific divine figure could be reached, the way a city's administrative offices are a specific address at which the city's administration can be reached. Nergal's nature was not gentle. The texts that describe him give a figure associated with fire and violence, with the heat that kills rather than the heat that nourishes, with the plague that moves through a city and the war that moves through a field. He was not, in other words, a deity whose characteristics seemed particularly suited to the quiet, administrative register of Ker's governance. The myth of Nergal and Ereshkigal, which exists in two principal surviving versions, describes how he arrived in the underworld in the first place. One version, a shorter account, was preserved not in Mesopotamia at all, but at Tel El Amarna in Egypt, recovered there as part of the wide scribal and diplomatic exchange of the 14th century BCE, which suggests how broadly these stories moved across the ancient world. The longer version, from Sultan Tepe in Assyria, dates to the 7th century BCE. Both versions describe Nergal descending to Ku as an uninvited guest, arriving in the underworld not through death, but through his own agency, and the events that followed his arrival, resulting, eventually, in a marriage alliance with Ereshkigal that made him co-ruler of the realm. The myth functions in part as an etiological account. It explains why the underworld has two rulers rather than one, and what kind of force the second ruler represents. What is useful to observe about Nergal, even setting the narrative of his arrival aside, is what his association with the underworld adds to its composition as a place, a realm already governed by a figure of grief and ancient authority, administered by a minister of fate and disease, was joined by a co-ruler who carried in his nature the direct and violent forms of death. Together these three figures, Ereshkigal, Nergal, and Namtar, account for much of what Mesopotamian tradition associated with dying, the slow diminishment and natural end of a life, the official registration of that death, and its dispatch to the underworld, and the sudden catastrophic deaths that came in numbers from war and plague. Khuptu's governing court, read in this way, was not a random collection of divine personalities. It was a structured institutional response to the full range of ways that lives ended. The Anunnaki of Ku occupied a different office than the three principal figures of the court. In the upper world, and in various Mesopotamian texts, the Anunnaki appear as a class of major divine beings associated with the great decisions of the cosmos, with the authority of the assembly of gods, with the setting of fates, and the maintenance of divine order. In Kuer, they retain this function, but in a diminished form that the texts describe with some consistency. They are depicted as pale, they are depicted as still. Whatever brightness or vitality they possessed in other contexts had been reduced, not by punishment or exile, but simply by the nature of the environment. Kuer diminished everything that entered it. The Anunnaki of the underworld were not expelled from their heavenly status and condemned to Kutha as a consequence of failure. They were simply the aspect of this class of gods that presided over the dead, and presiding over the dead in Kur meant participating in the same conditions as everyone and everything else that existed there. In Kur, one sat in the dark with dust on one's garments, regardless of one's office. Their function in Kur was that of judges. Summoned to assembly when judgment was required, they sat in deliberation on the fate of newly arrived souls, rendering verdicts on the condition and placement of the dead within the underworld structure. This assembly of judges is described in multiple Sumerian and Akkadian texts as sitting in silence, their deliberations unhurried, their verdicts delivered with the weight of divine authority, but without the noise or drama that might attend a human court. There is something in this image, the Anunnaki sitting pale and still in the dark of Kur, reduced from whatever they were above, conducting the business of judgment with careful attention, that the tradition seems to have understood as appropriate rather than tragic. Diminishment in Ker was not a punishment specific to the Anunnaki, it was the condition of Ker itself. They sat in that condition and did their work. The assembly of the Anunnaki in the underworld should be imagined as a specific gathering of specific figures in a specific room that had walls, that had a floor of packed earth, that had a ceiling of the same clay and mineral substance as the rest of Ker. They sat on seats that the texts do not describe in great material detail, in a space that did not have the architectural grandeur of a heavenly court, not because their authority was unreal, but because Ker had no grandeur to offer. It was a realm of clay and dust and absolute dark, and the Anunnaki who assembled within it assembled in those conditions, wearing the reduced and dusty garments that all permanent inhabitants of Ker wore. Their paleness, as the texts describe it, was not metaphorical. It was a condition of the place, the vitality that makes a living face vivid, the flush of blood, the movement of expression, the responsiveness to light, was absent in Ker, because Ker had none of its requirements. What remained was presence, memory, authority, and the administrative function of judgment. These were enough. The Anunnaki did their work in the dark, as they had always done it. Among the figures who populated the court and threshold spaces of Ker, one stands somewhat apart from the others in the specific nature of his role. Ornigishida, whose name translates as Lord of the Good Tree, occupied a liminal position that the texts describe as concerned with the boundary between the living world and Ker rather than with the interior governance of the realm itself. His iconography is notable. In the images that have survived from Mesopotamian visual culture, Ningishida is associated with serpents and with tree imagery, two symbols that in Mesopotamian cosmological thinking were both strongly chthonic, connected to the underground, to the roots of things, to the forces that move through the earth rather than above it. A serpent moves below the surface of the ground. A tree is rooted in the earth, with its living parts drawing from the depths to produce what appears in the light above. Both images suggest something that exists at the interface of the underground and the surface that connects these two registers of the world without being fully confined to either. Ningisida appears in the death of Ur-Nammu, the Sumerian text that describes the arrival of the king of the third dynasty of Ur in Ker after his unexpected death, in the role of companion and guide to newly arrived souls. In this capacity, he greets those who have just crossed into Ker and conducts them through the initial experience of arrival, guiding them from the boundary into the underworld proper with the particular familiarity of someone who has done this many times. His role is not punitive and not administrative in the way Namtar's role is administrative. It is something closer to welcome, the specific patient welcome of a figure who has been standing at this threshold for a very long time and who knows every arrival by sight, even before they have become fully accustomed to where they are. The death of Ur-Nammu shows Ur-Nammu entering Ker with gifts for its deities and beginning the ceremonial process of establishing himself in the new realm. Ningisida, in this account, is part of the receiving structure, the first familiar face, if any face in Ker could be called familiar, that a newly dead soul encountered on the other side of the crossing. There is something in Ningisida's liminal placement that separates him from the other figures of Ker's court in an interesting way. Ereshkigal governs the interior of the realm. Nargal co-governs beside her. Namtar administers and dispatches the business of fate and disease, the Anunnaki judge. But Ningisida waits at the threshold where the crossing happens, where the newly dead arrive, still carrying the habits and expectations of the upper world, still adjusting to the particular quality of darkness and silence that Kerr offers. He is described in a way that suggests not grandeur, but patience, the patience of long familiarity with arrivals, with the specific disorientation of new souls entering a place they have heard described but never seen, with the slow settling of each new arrival into the conditions of the realm. His serpent and tree iconography, set against the packed clay walls of Kerr's entrance passages, marks him as something that belongs genuinely to the earth, not as a foreign visitor descending from above, but as a figure who grew from the same deep mineral dark as the place he tends. The court of Kerr, read as an institution rather than as a dramatic setting, distributed its functions among its divine inhabitants with a specificity that the texts make legible across a span of thousands of years. Ereshkigal's ancient authority at the center, Nergal's violent energy at her side, arrived through a history the myths preserve in detail. Namtar's precise administrative function, moving through the corridors with his ledger of 60 responsibilities. The Anunnaki sitting in pale assembly at their judgment, conducting the adjudication of the dead with the institutional gravity of a court that has handled far more cases than any of those still remembered. Ningasido waiting at the entrance with the patience of a figure who belongs to the boundary itself. These offices were not interchangeable, they were not vague or overlapping. Each figure in Kerr's divine administration had a specific scope of authority, a specific relationship to the processes of death, and a specific location within the underworld's architecture. What the texts preserve, in their accumulated specificity, is a picture of Kerr as a governed place. This is worth sitting with, because it shapes the entire texture of how the realm was imagined. The dead who arrived in Kerr were not entering a void or a chaos. They were entering a jurisdiction. There were officials here. There were assembly rooms. There were processes of arrival, of judgment, of placement within the realm. The fate of a soul in Kerr was not random, according to the tradition. It was determined by a specific assembly of specific divine judges who had been performing this function since the earliest period of the written record. The darkness and dust that constituted Kerr's physical substance were not signs of lawlessness or disorder. They were the material conditions of a functioning realm, a realm whose administration happened to operate in the dark, without warmth, without green things growing, without the sounds of the living world overhead, a different environment than the one above, not a deficient one, not from the perspective of those who had always governed it. Ereshkigal's throne room returns as a frame. The queen sitting at the center of the dark hall, the darkness around her settled and permanent, the palace of Kerr extending outward from that room in all its corridors and chambers and threshold spaces, with its various officials going about their various works. Namtar, moving through the hall outside the throne room on his way to something administrative. The Anunnaki in their assembly somewhere deeper in the palace, pale and deliberate. Ningashida at the entrance, where the river crossing ends and the underworld properly begins. Nergal present as co-ruler, the violent aspect of death housed in the same realm as its quieter and more ancient governance. All of these figures in the same dark, all of them doing, with the specific gravity of divine officials in an old institution, the work that Kerr required of them. The institution of Kerr in this reading was not shaped by chance or by the arbitrary accumulation of divine personalities. It was shaped by the range of what death was, in Mesopotamian understanding, by all the ways a life could end, and all the processes required afterward. The court assembled to serve those processes, Ereshkigal at its head, because she was the oldest and the deepest authority in this realm, the one whose name was there from the beginning, the one whose grief and rage and long endurance of governance the texts describe with unusual intimacy. Around her, the figures whose specific functions handled what Kerr needed to handle: judgment, administration, boundary keeping, the management of fate's dispatches outward to the living world above. Together they constituted the court of a place that was not celebrated in Mesopotamian tradition, not longed for, not understood as the destination that the living work toward, but it was understood as real. It was understood as administered. It was understood as a place whose governance was specific and whose figures were named. There is something in the naming that deserves attention before closing. The names of Kerr's divine inhabitants are not generic. They are not placeholders or categories. Ereshkigal is not simply a death goddess. Namtar is not simply death's minister. Ningishthid is not simply a threshold figure. Each name carries its own etymology, its own iconography, its own accumulated history of appearance in texts and images across multiple centuries and multiple cities of the ancient Mesopotamian world. The tradition was careful with these names. It preserved them across tremendous spans of time, through the shift from Sumerian to Akkadian as the primary literary language of Mesopotamia, through the displacement of cities and dynasties and scribal traditions. The figures of Kor's court survived all of this, not because they were simple enough to travel unchanged, but because the tradition found them precise enough to keep. The preciseness of the court below, then, is one of the tradition's more enduring contributions. Not a vague realm of shadows attended by unnamed wardens, but a specific jurisdiction with a throne at its center, officials at their posts, an assembly of judges sitting in the dark with the accumulated caseload of all the dead who had ever been judged, and at the very edge of the whole structure, patient and still, the figure with the serpent and the tree standing where the living world ended and Kerr began. Ningisida at his threshold, as he has always stood, not watching the road for anything in particular, not restless, not waiting for anything to happen, simply present at the place where the two worlds met, the way a deep-rooted tree is simply present at the edge of two kinds of ground, drawing from both without belonging entirely to either, his quiet familiarity with the boundary itself, the most natural thing in all of Kerr. Enkidu's ghost came up through a specific hole in the earth. The text records it plainly, without ceremony. A gap opened in the ground, and through it something rose that was still recognizably Enkidu, still carrying the shape of the person Gilgamesh had known, still capable of speech. What it said about the place it now inhabited was careful and particular. It did not describe torment or oblivion. It described conditions, the dust, the clay, the quality of the light, which was no light at all, the kind of existence that was possible down there and the kind that was not. And then the gap closed, and whatever had come through it returned, and Gilgamesh was left in the upper world with the account of it, which is how the Sumerians understood this kind of knowledge to travel, not through vision or prophecy, but through the specific temporary opening of a boundary, and through the willingness of what came through to speak plainly about what it knew. The Sumerian term for this kind of presence was Giddim. The Akkadian equivalent was Atimah. Both words describe something that persists after death, not a dramatic haunting, not a soul ascending to a higher realm, but a continuation of the self in a diminished and quieter form, still present in kill, still retaining something of the personality and the memory of the living person it once was, but stripped of the full vitality that had animated it in the world above. The Giddim was not nothing. It was not quite something in the way the living are something. It occupied a category that the Mesopotamian traditions were careful to maintain, neither fully gone nor fully present, a shadow of selfhood rather than a negation of it. What the Giddim wore in Kir is described in several texts, and the descriptions share a particular quality. In place of the garments the dead had worn in life, the linen, the wool, the fabric that marks a person as belonging to a particular place and station, the dead in Kir wore something feather-like, or clay-like, or described in some translations as coverings made of dust itself. Not dramatic, not grotesque, simply different, a different material for a different mode of being. The Giddim stood in Kir wearing what Kir provided, which was the substance of Kir, its dust, its clay, its profound and unbroken dark, and this was not presented in the texts as a form of punishment or degradation, but simply as the condition. The way that water takes the shape of the vessel it is poured into, the Giddim took the substance of the place it now inhabited, settling into it the way sediment settles into the floor of a lake that no light reaches. The diet of the dead in Kir is described in the Akkadian descent of Ishtar with a phrase that carries its meaning precisely and without elaboration. The underworld is called the house where they eat clay and drink dust. The inversion is exact. In the upper world, the living ate grain and drank water, the products of the fertile earth that Kir categorically lacked, the food produced by sunlight and irrigation, and the cycles of growth that the dead world had no access to. In Kir, the substance that the living built their homes from walked on, worked with their hands into vessels and tablets and walls. That substance became the diet, clay and dust in place of bread, and water, not as metaphor alone, not as poetic ornamentation on the edge of a theological point, but as the Mesopotamian account of the actual experiential condition of the dead. This is what they consumed. This was the house they lived in. And the text describe it with the same tone they used to describe everything else about Kir, steady, documentary, as though reporting on a place that exists and has always existed, and whose conditions are simply what they are. This does not mean the condition was equal for everyone who arrived in Kir. The texts are very clear that it was not. What determined the quality of a Giddim's existence in the underworld was not the life it had lived above, not its virtue, or its piety, or its accomplishments in the world of the living, but two specific and practical things: whether the body had been properly buried, and whether the living descendants of the dead continued to perform the prescribed offerings. These two conditions are the axis around which the Mesopotamian understanding of the afterlife turns, and the text returned to them again and again as though the tradition needed to be certain the point was not missed. In Tablet 12 of the standard Babylonian Epic of Gilgamesh, a tablet that some scholars have argued was added to the larger composition from a different source, though it survived attached to the main text and was read as part of it, Enkidu's ghost describes what it saw in Kir, and the description is graduated. Those who had been well buried, whose families continued to pour offerings of food and oil and water into the earth at regular intervals, rested in Kir with a degree of provision. They had what they needed, in the underworld sense of need, which was modest and not comparable to the needs of the living, but was not nothing. Those who had died in battle and were honored in memory had their own particular standing. Those who had died without anyone to tend them, without descendants, without the ritual that bound the living and the dead together in an ongoing contractual relationship, wandered in Kir in a different condition entirely. They consumed the scraps discarded by better provided spirits. They ate what was left over. The text makes no moral judgment about the people in this condition. It simply records that this is what happened to those who arrived without provision, and without anyone in the upper world thinking of them. This was not a small matter. It was one of the central organizing concerns of Mesopotamian domestic life, and it had a specific name and a specific form. The kispu was the funerary meal offered to the ancestors, a regular, recurring ceremony performed by living family members at intervals that the texts describe and the households of ancient Mesopotamia observed for thousands of years across changing dynasties and shifting political circumstances, across the Sumerian and Akkadian and Babylonian and Assyrian periods, across distances of time that are difficult to hold steadily in mind. The form of the kispu was practical and precise. Food was set out, water was poured, oil was offered into the earth, into the ground, at the edge of a courtyard or near a tomb, or into the soil at the place where the ancestors were understood to receive what the living sent down. The offering was not a performance of grief, it was a transaction. The dead needed what the living provided, and in return, the dead, the properly tended ancestors, were understood to offer their descendants some degree of protection and benevolent attention, two different realms in ongoing contact through the material medium of food and oil and grain disappearing into the ground. The relationship was contractual in a way that the tradition found important to maintain. The living and the dead needed each other in very specific and practical ways. The dead needed provision, the kispu, to sustain them in a realm that produced nothing of its own, the burial that gave them a fixed and settled place in Kur, rather than the wandering condition of the improperly interred. The living needed the presence of the tended ancestors, whose protection was understood to extend through the fabric of daily life in ways both general and particular. And the maintenance of this relationship was not the province of temples or priests alone. It was domestic, ordinary, the kind of obligation that fell to the household as a whole, performed in courtyards and at tomb edges by families going about the regular business of existence. The kispu as much a part of the calendar as the harvest. There is something in this arrangement that belongs entirely to the Mesopotamian cosmological framework and resists translation into other terms. The underworld in this tradition was not a place of reward or punishment calibrated to the life the dead had lived. It was not sorted by virtue. Ur-Nammu, one of the most powerful kings of the third dynasty of Ur, the ruler who built ziggurats, who presided over what scholars identify as one of the earliest known law codes, who administered a city of extraordinary complexity and achievement, arrived in Kur after an unexpected death in battle, and the text that describes his arrival is not a text about a great king receiving great honors. The death of Ur-Nammu, composed in the period following the king's death around 2095 BCE, describes Ur-Nammu standing in the court of the underworld with gifts in hand, beginning the process of establishing himself in Kur, making offerings to the deities of the realm below, navigating an arrival protocol that was the same for him as it was for everyone else. He grieved in the text. He spoke of the city of Ur, of the unfinished building projects left behind, of the people he would not return to, of what it felt like to have arrived here without warning when there were still things undone in the world above. The text gives him this grief without diminishing it, and it also gives him the full arrival protocol, the gifts, the presentations, the formal acknowledgement of where he now was and under whose authority. The great king of a great city, standing before the assembled court of Kur with provisions in his hands, beginning again from the beginning, as every arrival did. The texts use the same word for his arrival that they use for anyone else's, the same verbs, the same structure. Death, in the Mesopotamian understanding, was the one condition that made everyone equivalent. not by elevating the poor to the standing of kings, but by reducing kings to the standing of everyone else. The social hierarchies of the living world dissolved at the crossing of the Hubor, and what arrived on the far bank was a Giddim carrying whatever was brought down from above, wearing what Ker provided. That Ur-Nammu needed to bring gifts to the major deities of the underworld to establish his place in the new realm, to make himself known, and in some degree settled in Ker, suggests that the arrival process was not instantaneous or automatic. There was work to be done upon arrival. There was protocol to navigate, and the king who had administered law codes and construction projects and the complex bureaucratic machinery of a major Sumerian city arrived in Ker, needing to perform the same administrative steps as anyone else, because the underworld had its own administration and its own court, its own hierarchy, and it did not recognize the hierarchies of the upper world as carrying any authority below. A grave in ancient Mesopotamia, prepared with care, with the right objects placed alongside the body, tells something of what the living believed was required for a good arrival: the vessels for food, the small objects that connected the dead to the life they had lived, the evidence of a family's careful attention to the question of how to send someone forward, well provisioned. Archaeologists working through the layers of ancient Mesopotamian cities have found graves arranged with a kind of deliberate specificity, not merely the placement of the body, but the arrangement around it of things understood to travel with the dead into Ker, things that would give the Giddim some material footing in the place it was going. These graves are the physical record of the belief that what was placed in the ground actually reached its destination, that the offering did not simply decompose in the soil, but made its way through whatever passage the tradition described to the realm below. The hole through which Enkidu's ghost ascended is described in the text as a specific opening, not a metaphor for the permeability of the boundary between the living and the dead, though it functions that way in the larger architecture of the story. A specific gap in the earth made by the sun god Utu at Gilgamesh's request, through which Enkidu's Giddim was able to rise briefly into the upper world and speak. The passage was temporary. The boundary was not meant to be permeable, and when the gap closed, Enkidu returned, and whatever knowledge he had carried up with him remained only in what he had managed to say before the opening sealed again. This is the logic of Tablet 12 throughout. The underworld is a real place with a real boundary, and the information that crosses that boundary is valuable precisely because it is so rarely available. What Enkidu said about the conditions of the dead was preserved because it was the closest thing available to a direct account. What he described was graduated, as has been noted, but the graduation was not moral, it was logistical. How many sons a man had left behind Tentenim, whether his body had been buried properly or left exposed, whether the living members of his family had kept the Kispor. The accounts Enkidu gave ranged from a man with 7 sons, whose offerings kept him well provided, to the miserable condition of those with no one at all in the upper world to remember them. And the text presents these conditions with the even attention of a report, no editorial insistence that any particular condition is tragic or just, only the description of what each condition amounts to, so that Gilgamesh, and through him the listener, understands the stakes of the choices the living make. What the Kispodes asked of the living was not complicated. It did not require a temple or a priest or any elaborate ritual apparatus. It required remembering. It required the regular, deliberate act of setting out food, pouring liquid, directing attention toward the dead, toward the specific named individuals of one's family who had crossed the Hubur and were now in Ker in whatever condition their burial and their provision had established for them. The ceremony was domestic enough that it could be performed in a courtyard, at the edge of a household garden, at the tomb, or near the place where the ancestor was interred. The oil poured into the earth, the grain set out, the water given. These were the material forms of a sustained relationship between the living and the dead, and the tradition held that this relationship was the thing that most shaped what Kher was like for those who had arrived there. There is an intimacy in this arrangement that sits quietly at the center of how the Mesopotamian traditions described the underworld. Kher was not a remote theological abstraction, not a place that only the dead encountered. It was in constant low-level contact with the living world through the medium of these domestic offerings, through the attention that households directed downward into the earth at regular intervals, through the names spoken during the kispo, through the food that disappeared into the ground and was understood, in the tradition's own terms, to arrive somewhere. The living world and the dead world were not sealed from each other. They were in correspondence, the way two distant people remain in correspondence through the letters they send, irregular contact across a large distance, but genuine contact, the kind that required specific action to maintain and that suffered specific consequences when neglected. The Giddim that had no one performing the kispo was not merely alone in Kuri. It was, in a sense, cut off from the primary means of provision that the tradition understood to sustain the dead. The scraps it consumed were not metaphorical. The wandering it did was not metaphorical. The Mesopotamian texts treat the condition of the poorly tended dead with the same documentary precision they apply to everything else about the underworld. This is what happens when the living do not maintain the relationship, described as plainly and as carefully as the conditions of the well-tended are described. There is no sentimentality in the description, but there is a very clear implication about what the living owe to those who have gone before them, and that implication shaped the way ordinary Mesopotamian households organized their relationship to their ancestors across thousands of years of practice. The Giddim, in its feather-like or clay-like coverings, consuming the substance of the underworld, retaining something of its personality and its memory, but not the full vitality that the living world had provided. This is one of the most specific and considered afterlife frameworks in the ancient world. Not a paradise, not a torment, not a transformation into something categorically different, a continuation, diminished and dark, sustained by the attention of those who remained above. The dead needed the living needed the dead, and the place where the dead resided was Kher, beneath the clay, beneath the soil of the fields and the floors of the houses, beneath the roots of the trees that the underworld's own terrain entirely lacked, down in the compressed and mineral dark, where the only light was what the texts called no light at all, and where the only food was the dust that covered everything, and where the Giddim of kings and farmers and craftspeople and mothers and children all arrived by the same crossing and settled into the same substance. Enkidu, when he came up through the hole in the earth, spoke plainly about what he had seen. He did not describe a place of punishment. He did not describe a place of rest. He described a place of conditions, specific, particular, graduated conditions that depended on what the living had done and were continuing to do. He described the man with 7 sons and the man with no one. He described the warrior honored in memory and the person left to wander. He described Kher the way a traveler describes a territory that is simply what it is, neither apologizing for it nor embellishing it, because the territory does not require embellishment, and because the person he was speaking to needed the account to be accurate rather than beautiful. And then the gap in the earth closed, and Enkidu descended again, and the account he had given remained in the upper world in the form of a story told on clay tablets, copied and recopied through the long centuries of Mesopotamian scribal practice, pressed into the earth of libraries and archives and storage rooms, where it waited in the dark for the kind of careful attention that, in a different way, the tradition had always asked the living to direct toward those who had gone before. The tablets that carry Enkidu's account of Kur are objects in the world, baked clay, compressed and dense, holding their content with a patience appropriate to the material. They were made to last. Clay, in the Mesopotamian tradition, was a medium for permanence, the substance chosen for records that needed to survive, legal agreements, administrative accounts, the literature that a civilization wished to carry forward, and the tablets that carry the account of Kur, of the Giddim in its clay-like coverings, consuming the dust of the underworld, of the Kispu poured into the ground by families at regular intervals for thousands of years. These tablets are themselves, in some small way, a form of the thing they describe, the substance of the earth, shaped by human hands, holding a record of what people believed about what the earth held beneath it. A family in a courtyard in an ancient Mesopotamian city, pouring oil into the soil in the late afternoon, speaking the names of their dead, setting out food at the edge of the earth. This was not an unusual scene. It was an ordinary one, repeated in ordinary places, by ordinary people across a span of time that exceeds the distance between the composition of those tablets and the present moment by several multiples. The oil disappearing into the ground, the grain set beside the place of offering, the names spoken quietly in the air of a courtyard that was like all courtyards, like all surfaces, like all the ground that anyone ever walked on, resting on the clay and the dark of the realm below. The dead in Kur received what was sent down. The living, in the act of sending it, directed their attention toward the specific persons who had crossed the Hubur, toward the names, the faces, the remembered presences of people who were still present, in their diminished and quiet way, in the darkness below the earth. And this ongoing direction of attention, this practice of remembering, specifically and regularly, the dead who needed the living to remember them, was not a spiritual exercise in the abstract sense. It was a practical relationship with real consequences for those on both sides of the boundary. The tradition maintained it, the text recorded it, the households of ancient Mesopotamia performed it, and the oil and the grain and the water went into the earth, season after season, in the old cities of the plain, while the Giddim of those who had been sent forward rested in the particular darkness of Kur, sustained by what arrived from above, wearing the substance of the place they now inhabited, still retaining something of the self they had carried down with them, across the roiling water of the Hubur, and waiting in the unhurried way of things that have nowhere further to go, for whatever the living chose to send. Enki gathered the dirt from beneath his fingernails. That is how the oldest version of the story begins, the rescue, not with a great assembly of gods, not with a storm or a decree, but with a god sitting quietly, working the dark matter from beneath his nails, collecting it in his palm until there was enough to make something small. From this material barely there, taken from the underside of his own hands, he fashioned two beings. They were tiny. Some translations hold that they were no larger than flies, small enough to pass through the gates of Kur as a breath passes through a crack in stone, and they carried between them two small portions of the food of life and the water of life tucked against their sides. He gave them their instructions. He sent them down. The world above kept turning while they went. This is the opening image of the Sumerian descent of Inanna, preserved on tablets recovered primarily from Nippur and belonging to the Old Babylonian period, the centuries running from around 1900 to 1600 years before the Common Era. The tablets themselves are older than most of what the Western tradition thinks of as ancient. The story they hold is thought to be older still, the written version inheriting from an oral tradition that had already been working with this material for generations before anyone pressed it into clay. What the tablets preserve is a story about a goddess who descended into the underworld by choice, who was killed there, and who was brought back through the action of two small creatures made from the dirt that had accumulated beneath a god's fingernails. It is not the kind of rescue story that announces its own greatness. It arrives quietly, the way the Kurgara and the Galatura arrived, without ceremony, without armor, simply present and carrying what was needed. The two small beings are named in the Sumerian text as the Kurgara and the Galatura. Their exact nature has been the subject of considerable discussion among scholars of the tradition. They are described in some readings as neither male nor female, existing outside the categories that other beings occupy, which is part of what allows them to enter Kor without being claimed by it. When Enki made them, he understood something about the underworld that the story does not state directly, but that the logic of the rescue implies that whatever was needed to pass through those gates and return had to be something that Ereshkigal could not simply hold. The Kurgara and the Galatura were the answer to that problem. Small, sexless, barely there, carrying only what Enki had instructed them to carry. They descended through the 7 gates, each gate opening before them as it opened before anyone who came, and they moved through the dark of Kor toward the place where Inanna was. The condition of Inanna when they found her is described in the descent plainly. She had been struck dead by the gaze of Ereshkigal and the 7 Anunnaki, the great judges who sit in assembly in the underworld and render verdicts on all who come before them. Her body had been hung on a hook in the dark. The Sumerian word used for this is one scholars have spent time with. It carries the sense of something placed in suspension, held in a condition between one state and another, neither properly living nor properly among the long-established dead. The Kurgara and the Galatura found her there. They did what Enki had instructed them to do. They sprinkled the food of life and the water of life upon her, once and then again, and then a third time. The text is exact about the repetition. 3 times the food, 3 times the water, and Inanna rose from the dead. What the story does with that moment is instructive. It does not slow for it. There is no pause to mark the strangeness of what has just occurred. A goddess killed in the innermost room of the underworld, hung on a hook in the dark, brought back to life by 2 tiny beings carrying provisions in small pouches. The descent of Inanna simply continues. Inanna rose from the dead. The Anunnaki assembled. The condition of her release was set. She could leave Kor, but the law of the underworld required that someone take her place. The underworld does not release what it holds without receiving something in return. A company of Gala, the spirits that serve as the enforcers of Kor's claims on the living, accompanied her back through the gates and up through the world, watching to see who she would give to them. Each figure who met her weeping and clothed in mourning, she passed by. Each one was already grieving. The Gala would not take them. It was only when she reached her own city of Uruk and found her husband Dumuzi seated on his throne in fine garments, not weeping, apparently undisturbed by her absence. Only then did she turn and indicate to the Gala that he was the one, and the Gala took him. This is where the descent of Inanna opens into something wider than the journey to Kor and back. Dumuzi, the shepherd king of the Sumerian tradition, becomes the figure who descends in Inanna's place, and the tradition holds a cycle within a cycle. Dumuzi spending part of the year in the underworld, then returning, his sister Geshtinana taking his place for the half of the year he rests in the world above. The cycle maps onto the agricultural year with the quiet logic of a myth that has found its cosmological home. The descent and return are not a single event, but a rhythm, ongoing, the year itself shaped by this alternation between the world of the living and the world of the dead. What began with Enki collecting dirt from beneath his fingernails opened into an account of how the seasons work, why the grain grows and then does not, why what lives must periodically be given back before it can return again. The Akkadian version of this story, the descent of Ishtar, Ishtar being the Akkadian name for the goddess the Sumerians called Inanna, survives most completely in tablets from the great library assembled by the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal at Nineveh in the 7th century before the Common Era. The Descent of Ishtar is a shorter text than its Sumerian predecessor, condensed, the descent and return carried through more quickly, certain interior details of the Sumerian version simplified or left aside. But the Akkadian version adds something that the Sumerian text approaches only indirectly, and the addition shapes the whole. While Ishtar is in the underworld, according to the Akkadian account, all reproduction ceases in the world above. The bull does not go to the cow. The man does not approach the woman. The world above Ker continues in every other respect. The sun moves, the winds move, the river moves, but the particular activity of reproduction, of one living thing making another, simply stops. The fields are quiet in a way they were not before. The animals stand in their places without the usual urgency. The world keeps its shape, but has lost one specific motion, and the absence of that motion is described in the text with the calm precision of a scribe recording what happened. This detail establishes something about Ishtar that the Akkadian tradition was more interested in emphasizing than its Sumerian counterpart. Her role is the deity of fertility in its most basic sense, not just desire or love or the specific passions of named individuals, but the biological fact of generation itself, the continuation of living things as a class. When she was in the underworld, that function paused. The cosmos did not end, nothing so dramatic, but it registered her absence in the one way most specific to her, the way a room registers the absence of its source of warmth, not by collapsing, but by growing slowly cooler in every corner. The world above Ker, during Ishtar's stay in the land of no return, was a world that had quietly stopped making itself. The messenger sent to Ea, the Akkadian name for the god the Sumerians called Enki, is not described in the Akkadian version with the same domestic detail as in the Sumerian. No dirt beneath the fingernails, no kurgara and galatura fashioned from that material. The descent of Ishtar moves more quickly to its resolution. A figure called Asushanamir, dispatched to Ker carrying the food of life and water of life. Ereshkigal compelled to release Ishtar under protest and with a curse laid on Asushanamir as the price of her compliance. The Akkadian version has a flavor of bureaucratic negotiation that is its own kind of pleasure. The underworld releasing its claim on the world above, not through transformation or emotional confrontation, but through something that resembles contractual obligation, the terms of the cosmos being more or less correctly invoked, the machinery adjusting. And then Ishtar ascends through the gates, each item of her divine adornment being restored to her at each successive threshold, the crown and the beads and the breastplate and the ring returning to their proper places as she moved upward into the world above. The Akkadian text is spare about her return. She comes back through the gates, the world resumes. The Epic of Gilgamesh, assembled in its standard Babylonian version sometime in the first millennium before the Common Era, and preserving in its 12th tablet material that scholars understand to be drawn from an older Sumerian poem, carries a different kind of descent into Kur, one that arrives not from divine necessity or cosmic purpose, but from a very specific and domestic accident. Gilgamesh dropped something. In the Sumerian poem from which Tablet 12 derives, two objects belonging to Gilgamesh, the puku and the meku, translated by some scholars as a drum and drumstick, by others as a ball and mallet, the exact nature still debated, fell through a hole in the earth and passed down into Kur. Enkidu, Gilgamesh's companion, volunteered to descend and retrieve them. Gilgamesh gave him careful instructions about how to behave in the underworld. Do not do this thing. Do not do that thing. Do not put on clean garments or anoint yourself with sweet oil. Do not behave as you would in the world above, because Kur is not the world above, and its rules are not its rules. Enkidu listened, and then, once he had descended, he did the things Gilgamesh had told him not to do. The Sumerian poem is specific about this. Enkidu put on clean garments. He anointed himself with sweet oil. He threw a stick, perhaps the meku itself, perhaps in play, perhaps out of habit. He made the sounds of the living in a place whose inhabitants had left sound behind them. And because he violated the conditions of proper conduct in the underworld, he could not return. The underworld kept him. Gilgamesh, left above, mourned. He went before the assembly of the gods. He went before Enlil, and Enlil would not help. He went before Nana, and Nana would not help. He went before Enki, and Enki helped. Enki called upon the sun god Utu to open a hole in the earth, a specific small passage between the world above and the world below. And through this hole, Enkidu's ghost rose, not Enkidu himself, who could not come back, but his Itemu, his spirit, the diminished and shadowy continuation of the person he had been, rising up through the opening in the earth for long enough to speak. What the ghost of Enkidu tells Gilgamesh is the most detailed account in Mesopotamian literature of what the underworld actually looks like from the inside, what it is to be a Giddim, a spirit of the dead, in the land of dust and clay. The ghost describes it to Gilgamesh, and Gilgamesh asks again and again about the conditions of specific kinds of dead. The man who has many sons, the man who has no sons, the warrior killed in battle, the man who died in fire, and the ghost answers each question with the same quiet specificity. The man with many sons drinks clean water. The man who has no one to offer the Kispu wanderings incur and eats scraps. The categories multiply, each one a small instruction to the living about what they need to do for the dead they have left behind, what the quality of existence incur depends upon. The conversation between Gilgamesh and the ghost of Enkidu is a remarkable document, a king and a ghost, speaking through a hole in the earth that the sun god opened on request, the ghost giving information to the living because the living need to know it. The hole stays open for the duration of the conversation, then it closes. The puku and the meku, whatever they were, presumably remained in Kur. The original reason for the descent, retrieving two small objects from the underworld, dissolved in the larger account of what the descent produced. What was recovered was not the drum and the drumstick, but the description of the land below, the testimony of someone who had been there and stayed. The objects are still down there, somewhere in the dark of Kur, small and unretrievable, the occasion for one of the most sustained accounts of the afterlife in all of Mesopotamian literature, which is the kind of trade that only looks disproportionate until you consider what was actually at stake. The myth known as Nergal and Ereshkigal carries a different shape than the descent narratives. It is an account of how the underworld came to have the government it has, how the realm that had always been Ereshkigal's alone came to be shared with a second ruler. The story survives in two principal versions. The earlier one was found not in Mesopotamia at all, but in Egypt at Tel el Amarna, the city built by the pharaoh Akhenaten, and it dates to the 14th century before the Common Era. That a Mesopotamian myth about the rulers of the underworld was preserved in a clay tablet found in Egypt speaks to how widely these stories traveled, how thoroughly they were woven into the scribal and diplomatic exchange of the ancient Near East. A scribe somewhere in the 14th century carried this story westward across hundreds of miles of land and sea, and it sat in the earth of Egypt for over 3,000 years before it was found. The later, longer version comes from Sultantepe in Assyria and belongs to the 7th century before the Common Era, 7 centuries younger than the Tel el Amarna tablet, significantly more elaborate in its narrative development. What both versions hold is this: Nergal, the god associated with war, plague, and the destructive heat of the summer sun, a figure whose cult was centered at the ancient city of Kutha, descended into the underworld as an uninvited guest, and then, through a series of events that differ in their specifics between the two versions, but converge on the same outcome, became Ereshkigal's husband and co-ruler of her realm. The earlier Tel Amarna version is compact, almost skeletal in its compression, the bones of the story legible without the surrounding flesh that the later Sultantepe version supplies. In the later version, the events that lead to the marriage are extended and psychologically elaborated. Ereshkigal given significantly more interiority, and the dynamics between the two figures allowed to develop across many more lines of text. Both versions arrive at the same cosmological fact. The underworld has two rulers now, Ereshkigal, who was always there, and Nergal, who came from elsewhere and did not leave. What the myth of Nergal and Ereshkigal establishes is not only the marital arrangement of the underworld court, but something about the relationship between death and destruction in Mesopotamian cosmological thinking. Nergal's association with war and plague, with the killing functions that operated in the world above, becomes connected through his marriage to Ereshkigal with the administration of the dead in the world below. The deity whose domain was the death of the living became the co-ruler of the place the dead went to. The connection has a certain structural logic, the one who kills and the one who receives the killed, unified in a shared governance. The underworld, as the Mesopotamian tradition understood it, had room for both. The death of Ur-Nammu stands apart from the other major narratives associated with Kur, because its central figure is not a god or a demigod, but a historical person, a specific human king, whose death could be approximately dated, and whose city still stood on the earth above, while his story was being composed. Ur-Nammu was the founder of the third dynasty of Ur, a ruler who built ziggurats and codified one of the earliest known law systems, whose reign began around 2112 years before the Common Era, and who died, the poem suggests, in circumstances that felt premature and troubling to those he left behind. The death of Ur-Nammu is a lament for him, composed in the aftermath of his death, and it takes the form of a journey, his arrival in Kur described in careful detail, the protocol of his reception documented, the gifts he presents to the major deities of the underworld enumerated. What Ur-Nammu's arrival in Kur looks like, according to the poem, is the arrival of any person who has just died, confused, grieving, laden with offerings, beginning again from nothing, in a realm where his authority as king counts for nothing until he has established himself through the correct ceremonies. The text gives him gifts for the major figures of the underworld court, and it describes the act of giving these gifts as a formal process. The king of a great earthly city performing the same arrival protocol as anyone else, the same humble beginning in the dark that the tradition understood to be universal. A man who had built the great ziggurat at Ur, who had governed one of the most powerful cities in the ancient world, stood in the throne room of Ker and presented offerings, and his greatness above was not a credential that transferred below. There is a quality to the death of Ur-Nammu that the other major Ker narratives do not quite share, a specifically human weight, the grief of a person who was alive recently and is not alive now, whose city is still standing, whose building projects are still underway, whose people are still present in the world above, even as he stands in the dark of the world below. The poem gives Ur-Nammu a voice that speaks of Ur with longing, the city, the unfinished work, the people he governed, all of it continuing without him while he begins the slow process of establishing himself in his new realm. The myth does not resolve this grief. It holds it as the condition of the dead who were alive enough, recently enough, that the living world is still fully present to them in memory. The text is not consoling about this, it simply records it. The stories of Ker have a way of returning, across their very different shapes and concerns, to the same small set of images. The darkness that functions not as absence, but as the material quality of the place itself. The dust that settles without urgency onto the garments of the dead. The gates that open one at a time, each one a step further from the sky. The food and water of life carried in small containers by small beings through an enormous dark. The ghost that rises through a hole in the earth and speaks for as long as it is permitted to speak. The king standing with his gifts, beginning again. The world above that goes quiet in one specific and important way when someone essential to it is below. These images do not resolve into a single message about death or the afterlife. They do not sum to a single doctrine. They persist the way images persist, present in themselves, returning because they are the images the tradition kept reaching for when it tried to describe the place the dead go, and what happens there, and what it means to be someone who knew them. The Kurgara and the Galatura, moving through the dark of Ker with their small provisions, are one of those persistent images. Two beings fashioned from the material found under a god's fingernails, carrying the food and water of life through the gates of the land of no return. They are minor figures in the story. They appear, they act, they presumably depart, and yet the image of them is one of the most quietly striking things the Descent of Inanna preserves. Not a warrior, not a hero, not a deity of great power descending in glory. Two small things, barely there, carrying exactly what was needed. The myth's instinct about what kind of force is capable of entering the underworld and leaving again seems to be this: something that does not carry anything the underworld can claim. The Akkadian descent of Ishtar adds to this the picture of the world above during her absence. The fields, the animals, the quality of stillness that settled over the living world while the goddess of generation was in the land of no return. That stillness is described in the Akkadian text with the same calm matter-of-factness that describes everything else, not as catastrophe, not as horror, but as the simple condition of a world temporarily missing something essential to it. The text records it as a geographer records terrain. This is the condition that obtained during the period in question. This is what the world above was like when Ishtar was below. And then there is the Tel El Amarna tablet, carrying its Mesopotamian story about the rulers of the underworld across the sea to Egypt, preserved there for 33 centuries in the earth of a city built by a pharaoh whose own tradition had its own elaborate account of what happened after death. Two different cosmologies of the dead existing in the same landscape at the same time in diplomatic exchange. The scribes who copied the Nergal and Ereshkigal story at Amarna presumably knew something about the Egyptian understanding of the afterlife as well. They worked in a building where both were available. What they made of the comparison, the tradition does not record, but the tablet was there, and it was preserved, and it was found, and it can still be read. The clay tablet that holds the death of Ur-Nammu is a physical object with a particular presence in the hand, baked clay, dense, impressed with a stylus, the small regular marks of cuneiform pressed into its surface by someone sitting in a scribal workshop in ancient Mesopotamia, working carefully, preserving the story of a king who had died and whose arrival in the world below needed to be set down so that it would not be lost. The tablet was buried, in whatever way tablets come to be buried, in the collapse of the building that held them, in the accumulation of time, in the slow deposit of earth over everything that stopped being maintained. It sat in the dark for a very long time, which is perhaps an appropriate place for a text about the land of dust and clay to spend its years. When it was excavated and read, the story it held came back out of the dark, the way the ghost of Enkidu came out through the hole in the earth, faint, diminished, but still carrying something recognizable of the person it had been. What the death of Ur-Nammu preserves, after all that time, is not only the king's arrival in Kurds, but the fact that people in ancient Mesopotamia thought it mattered what happened to him there. Someone composed this poem, someone wrote it down. Someone thought that the story of how a recently dead king arrived in the underworld, what he said to the assembled court, what gifts he brought, how he expressed his grief for the city he had left, someone thought all of this was worth setting in clay. The care of that act of preservation is itself a kind of document. Not just the text, but the fact of the text, the decision to make it, the decision to keep it, the tradition that produced the descent of Inanna and the descent of Ishtar and the Nergal and Ereshkigal myth and the passages of the Epic of Gilgamesh that open into the underworld. That tradition kept looking at the land below the earth and composing, as carefully as it could, what it understood to be there. The Kurgara and the Galatora have been in the dark a long time, making their quiet way through the gates of Kur, no larger than flies, carrying what Enki gave them. Inanna has risen from the hook and walked back through the 7 gates into the world above. Ishtar has received her adornments back, one at each threshold, climbing toward the light with everything that she descended, wearing Enkidu's ghost has spoken what it knows through the hole that the sun god opened and then closed. Nergal has found his way to a throne in the dark beside Ereshkigal. Ur-Nammu has made his offerings and begun the slow work of establishing himself in a new realm. The tablets that hold these stories have spent long stretches of time in the earth, which is the same earth that lies above Kur in the Mesopotamian understanding, the ceiling of the underworld and the floor of the world. The living walk on, continuous, one substance pressed between the sunlit surface and the dark below. The stories were in the clay, and the clay was in the ground, and the ground was above the land of no return. And all of this is still the case even now, the world still arranged the way the tradition described it, the underworld still there beneath the surface, dense and dark and silent, the river Huber still moving through it in the dark with the steadiness of water that has always been moving and has no reason to stop. The death of Ur-Nammu sits somewhere in a museum, or in a scholar's notes, or in a digital archive, baked and legible and still carrying in its small marks the story of a king arriving in the dark below with gifts. The tradition that made it is still the shape it was when it was made. The land of dust and clay is still where the Mesopotamian understanding placed it, beneath the floor of the world, below the feet of everyone who walks above it, cool and still and receiving